The most famous outlaw of the American Old West, the man Hollywood turned into a legend for over 140 years, and the man who turned Billy the Kid into a killer of 21 people. He probably invented most of that story. His last words were in Spanish. No movie tells you that. The archives of the New Mexico Territory tell you that. On July 14, 1881, near midnight, a young man entered a dark room in Fort Sumner without a lamp, without seeing who was inside. He noticed someone was there and asked a question. What came out of his mouth in that moment was in Spanish. The exact words have been debated for 140 years. Sheriff Pat Garrett's account says they were, "Quién es? ¿Quién es? Who is it? Who is it?" In the Spanish-speaking towns of New Mexico, in the homes of Mexican families who had hidden him for years, the phrase passed down through generations was different. ¿Quién anda ahí? Who goes there? No one can say with certainty which of the two is exact, but both have something in common: the language. The most famous outlaw of the West, in the last second of his life, thought in Spanish. Why does that detail change everything? That's what you're going to understand in this documentary. To cross this border, we audited the original judicial archives of the New Mexico Territory and the academic studies of Lincoln County. What you're about to hear comes from there. The figure of 21 people Billy the Kid killed, the one repeated for 100 years in movies, series, and books. Historians today place it at fewer than 10. Some say 4. But what matters isn't the number. What matters is that a named man invented that number. A man who was never in Fort Sumner that night, who needed money, and who wrote the book that built the legend you know. Who was that man, and what did he gain from all of this? You'll find out in Chapter 2. If you watched Young Guns with Emilio Estevez, you have an image of Billy the Kid that has been installed for over 140 years. What the archives show is different. Before this documentary ends, you'll know why the Mexican communities of New Mexico protected Billy for years as one of their own, who really built the legend, and what happened 69 years later in Fort Sumner, when a 90-year-old man appeared before the governor of New Mexico with a story that still hasn't been closed. 3 chapters: the boy no one wanted, the war that turned him into an outlaw, and the night that, 144 years later, still doesn't have a single version everyone accepts. If you made it this far, it's because you prefer real history to the movie version. This channel exists for you. No one knows exactly where he was born. Documents from the New Mexico Territory record him as William H. Bonney. Before that, he was Henry McCarty, Henry Antrim, Kid Antrim, 4 names for one man. On the American frontier of the 1860s, having multiple names was a survival tool, not a crime. What is documented is that his mother was Catherine McCarty, Irish, and that she died of tuberculosis in 1874. Billy was 14 or 15. There's no consensus on his exact age or birth date. Most likely, according to territorial archives, he was born around 1859. But even that isn't certain. What is certain is what remained when his mother died. Nothing. A stepfather who didn't want to take care of him, an older brother looking for his own path, and a New Mexico Territory that in those years was still a frontier without clear law, without fixed judges, without any order other than what the strongest imposed. But to understand what happened to Billy in that territory, you first have to understand what kind of place it was. New Mexico in the 1870s had very little to do with the West of the movies. It was a much more complicated and much more dangerous place. For a young, white, Anglo-Saxon boy without family and without money arriving in Lincoln County at that time, the landscape was very specific. To the north, the mountains; to the south, the Chihuahuan Desert; in the middle, the Pecos River; and bordering the river, the ranches. The big ranches belonged to newly arrived Anglo-Saxons with capital. But the men who worked those ranches, who herded cattle, who knew the terrain, who could read summer storms before they arrived, those men spoke Spanish. It was the Spanish of work, of negotiating in the market, of describing the terrain, of warning of danger. Billy the Kid entered that territory alone at 15. The first thing he learned wasn't how to shoot. The first thing he learned was Spanish. In the New Mexico Territory of the 1870s, Spanish was the language of work, of commerce, of the people who had been on that land for decades before the Anglos arrived. The Mexican ranchers, the families of the Pecos Valley, the cowboys who handled the cattle, all spoke Spanish, and Billy, who arrived without money, without family, without anyone who knew him, understood very quickly that Spanish was his best tool. What no one tells you is how that kind of Spanish is learned. That says more about Billy the Kid than any gun. There's only one way to speak with that fluency, to think in that language when fear comes at night. Before the end of this video, you'll understand it. Of Billy the Kid, there is only one authentic photograph widely accepted, a ferrotype taken around 1879. In 2011, that photograph sold at auction for $2.3 million. It's the only real face we know of him. Several studies on Lincoln County history document that Billy moved fluently among Spanish-speaking communities. But there's a difference between moving fluently and belonging, and Billy belonged. The Mexican communities of New Mexico had their own name for him. They didn't call him Billy the Kid like the Anglo newspapers. They called him Bilito, the affectionate diminutive in Spanish. That name is documented. It was used by the men who fought alongside him. Eugenio Salazar was one of them, a Mexican from New Mexico who joined the Regulators alongside Billy. Years later, when asked how he remembered Billy the Kid, he said, "The bravest man I ever knew, one who knew no fear." The archives hold that testimony. The movies don't. That nickname, Bilito, wasn't an insignificant detail. The Mexican communities of New Mexico didn't give that name to just any Anglo. There was something about Billy that made those families see him differently from everyone else. In a few minutes, you'll know exactly what it was. But speaking Spanish wasn't enough to survive in that territory, because New Mexico in 1876 had a problem Billy didn't yet know about. It was a territory in economic dispute. Trade, government contracts, meat supply to the army. Everything was controlled by a very small group of men who had arrived earlier and had no intention of sharing power. The leader of that group was Lawrence Murphy. With him worked James Dolan. Together, they controlled the only major store in Lincoln County. They set prices as they wished, bought from whomever they wanted, and destroyed anyone who tried to compete. If someone opened a new business, Murphy and Dolan made sure it didn't last, with legal pressure if they could, with other means if they couldn't. In Lincoln County of the 1870s, Murphy and Dolan were the law, and the law had a price. Billy the Kid arrived in that territory knowing nothing of that. What he did know was how to work. And in 1877, at 17 or 18, he found employment on the ranch of an Englishman named John Henry Tunstall. Here's a fact almost no movie includes. John Tunstall was 24 years old when he met Billy the Kid. 24. That changes the entire story cinema built about that relationship. John Tunstall had arrived in the New Mexico territory with his own capital, business vision, and the idea that he could compete with Murphy and Dolan. He offered better prices to ranchers, paid his employees well, and treated Billy in a way very few had ever treated him, as someone who mattered. Testimonies from the time describe Billy saying that Tunstall was the first man who treated him with kindness, asking nothing in return. That sentence tells you everything you need to know about Billy the Kid's childhood. Think about this for a second. A 17-year-old without family, who grew up in a territory where men are measured by what they can take from you, suddenly finds someone who treats him as an equal. That's not forgotten. That's not betrayed. But Tunstall represented a direct threat to Murphy and Dolan. In Lincoln County of 1878, direct threats were resolved in only one way. On February 18, 1878, a group of men sent by James Dolan intercepted John Tunstall in a canyon of the New Mexico territory. Tunstall was alone, without weapons raised. Dolan's men surrounded him. He was 24 years old. They shot him dead. Billy was a few miles away when it happened. When they brought him the news, testimonies from the time say he didn't scream. He stood still for a moment, then said something those present remembered years later. "I'm going to kill the men who did this." What he felt that afternoon was something very specific. It was the confirmation that the world worked exactly as he had always suspected. Those with money and weapons did what they wanted, and those with neither had only two options: flee or respond. Billy the Kid was 18. He didn't flee. He joined a group of men who called themselves the Regulators. Their mission was one thing: to bring justice for Tunstall's death. They called him Kid because when all this started, he was the youngest in the group, 17 or 18, beardless, with an angel face, according to those who knew him. The name changed depending on the language. The man was the same. And that's where the war begins. But the Lincoln County War wasn't what the movies showed. It was something much dirtier, with a governor who promised solutions and kept none, a sheriff who was bought, and a book written years later by someone who turned Billy into something he may never have been. And that's where everything changed. In the summer of 1878, the governor of the New Mexico Territory was a man named Lew Wallace. At night, when government papers could wait, Wallace wrote something else, a novel. The story of a Jewish prince in the time of ancient Rome, his fall, his slavery, and his revenge. The novel would be called Ben-Hur. It would be published in 1880. It would become the best-selling book of the 19th century after the Bible. Meanwhile, in Lincoln County, the war continued. The Regulators had been born after Tunstall's death, a group of armed men who declared themselves vigilantes. Billy the Kid was one of them, the youngest, the fastest, and the most determined that no one forget why they were there. The objective was clear: find the men who had killed Tunstall and make them answer. What followed wasn't justice. It was an escalation neither side could stop. The Regulators killed Sheriff William Brady on the main street of Lincoln on April 1, 1878. Brady was Dolan's man. Billy shot that morning. Witnesses saw him. He was convicted for that death in the Masilla trial 3 years later, though the discussion of whether it was Billy's direct shot or another Regulator's remains open among historians. And here's where the story takes a turn, no movie included. Because Billy the Kid, in the middle of a war where they were looking for him dead or alive, made a decision no movie outlaw would have made. He decided to write a letter to the governor. The worst months of the war came in July 1878. What the archives call the Battle of Lincoln lasted 5 days. 5 days in a dusty town with a single main street, adobe houses, and neighbors barricading themselves in their homes, while both sides shot from windows and rooftops. McSween's faction, the lawyer allied with Tunstall, the man who had tried to win the war through legal means, barricaded themselves in his own house, an adobe building in the center of town. Inside were McSween, his wife Susan, several armed men, and Billy the Kid. Dolan's men had the town. They also had the new sheriff, George Pepin, on their side. And they had something else: soldiers from the nearby fort that Governor Wallace had sent to restore order, an order that in practice favored the side that controlled the sheriff. The days passed with sporadic gunfire. July sun, heat pounding on the adobe, water rationed. On the 4th day, Dolan's men set fire to McSween's house. The fire started at the rear. Adobe doesn't burn easily. That's why southwestern houses were built that way. But the wood of the frames, the furniture, the roof beams, that did burn. Susan McSween went out first, negotiated her passage with Dolan's men, and crossed the street alive. Her husband, Alexander, tried to leave after her. He was killed on the threshold of his own door. Billy the Kid was inside when the flames reached the back room. He had spent the last days with smoke, heat, and the certainty that if he went out the front door, the same fate as Tunstall awaited him. He chose the side window, jumped into the darkness with his revolver in hand, ran crouched toward the river, and the shots that came behind him didn't find him. He ran out into the open field in the darkness. He was 18 years old. Behind him, the town of Lincoln burned with McSween's house. Ahead of him, hundreds of miles of New Mexico desert, without money, without living allies, and with the name Billy the Kid on every arrest warrant in the territory. And from that night, he was the most wanted man in the New Mexico Territory. But what Billy did next is what no movie dared to show, because what he did separated him from any movie outlaw. He did something someone who still believed could do. After everything he had seen, Billy still believed that justice could work. In March 1879, after months moving between the Mexican ranches of the Pecos Valley, he made that decision. He wrote to Governor Lew Wallace. The governor responded. In March 1879, Billy the Kid and Governor Lew Wallace met in secret at a judge's house in the town of Lincoln. At 9 at night, without official witnesses, a 19-year-old wanted for murder sat in front of the man who was writing Ben-Hur. What they said to each other that night is documented in the archives. What happened after is one of the bitterest stories of the real Old West. Wallace offered something concrete. If Billy testified about the crimes committed during the Lincoln County War, the governor would guarantee him legal protection. It wasn't a signed pardon, but it was a promise from the man who governed the territory. Billy accepted. He testified. And then he waited. The governor went back to Santa Fe, to his papers, to Ben-Hur. The protection never came. The charges against Billy didn't disappear. The sheriff who should have protected him was still looking for him. And Billy, who had kept his part of the deal, understood that no one in that territory was going to keep theirs. He went back into hiding in the Mexican communities of the Pecos Valley. The same families who had always protected him. The same houses where Spanish was the language of every conversation. Those Mexican communities opened their homes to him for years, even when he was the most wanted man in the territory. The real reason for that loyalty is something this documentary will explain before it ends. And when you hear it, you'll understand why that phrase from the Fort Sumner night in Spanish was no accident. Now, speaking Spanish wasn't enough to survive in that territory, because in November 1880, Lincoln County elected a new sheriff. His name was Pat Garrett. He was 29 years old. He was a tall, reserved man, very aware of what it meant to capture the territory's most famous outlaw. Garrett and Billy knew each other from the same frontier world. They weren't close friends as cinema later constructed. They were two men from the same territory who had lived in the same spaces for years and were now on opposite sides of the same line. In December 1880, Garrett captured Billy the Kid in Stinking Springs, New Mexico, without gunfire. Billy surrendered when he saw there was no way out. He was tried in Mesilla, New Mexico, in April 1881, sentenced to death for the murder of Sheriff Brady. Billy the Kid was condemned to the gallows. Garrett left him in Lincoln under guard while he prepared the execution. 2 guards, a 2-story building, Billy handcuffed. What happened on April 28, 1881, in that Lincoln building is one of the most calculated scenes in the entire real Old West. It wasn't luck. It was what someone who reads spaces and people better than anyone had been planning for months. On April 28, 1881, Billy the Kid asked permission to go to the outhouse on the ground floor. Guard James Bell accompanied him back up the stairs. At some point during that climb, testimonies don't exactly agree on how Billy got hold of Bell's revolver. Bell tried to escape outside. Billy shot. Bell fell dead on the stairs. The second guard, Bob Olinger, was across the street eating when he heard the shot. He ran toward the building. Billy had gone up to the second-floor window. He had Olinger's own double-barreled shotgun that Olinger had left inside when he went to eat. He called to Olinger from above before shooting. Olinger looked up. Billy fired both barrels. Olinger died in the street without understanding what had happened. Billy took almost an hour to remove the handcuffs, broken on one wrist but not the other. A passerby brought him a horse. Billy rode slowly down Lincoln's main street, singing according to testimonies from neighbors who watched from windows. He rode south, toward Fort Sumner, toward the Mexican families who were waiting for him. That's what the archives documented. But what comes now is the part no movie ever fully told. Because the story the world knows of Billy the Kid wasn't written by Pat Garrett. It was written by someone who was never in Fort Sumner that night. And what that man wrote changed history forever. Garrett pursued for 2 months. On July 14, 1881, he found what he was looking for in Fort Sumner. That night you already know. The dark room, the words in Spanish, the gunshot. A year later, in 1882, a book appeared. It was called The Authentic Life of Billy the Kid, and it carried Pat Garrett's name on the cover. It was the book that fixed the myth, that described Billy as the killer of 21 men, that built the image of the relentless outlaw Hollywood used for 100 years without questioning it. But that book wasn't written by Garrett. It was written by a journalist named Marshall Ashman Upson. And here's the secret I promised at the beginning of this documentary. Upson was a frontier journalist who had lived in the same territory as Billy for years, who knew the stories secondhand and who needed money. He was never in Fort Sumner that night. He was never a witness to the events he described. Garrett needed the story of his capture to sound big enough to justify his career. Both had clear interests. Both won. The book attributed 21 deaths to Billy the Kid. Historian Robert Utley, in his definitive biography of the character, the most cited in academia, concluded that Billy may have killed as few as 4 men. The only 2 deaths confirmed with high historical certainty are those of James Bell and Bob Olinger, the guards from the Lincoln escape. The third, Sheriff Brady, was the basis of his conviction, though the exact attribution remains in academic discussion. The remaining 16 deaths, Upson included, have no name, no verified date, and no witnesses to support them. 16 invented deaths in a book signed by the man who pulled the trigger. That book was the basis of 30 movies, 2 television series, and a century later inspired the best-selling Western video game in history, Red Dead Redemption 2, with 85 million copies sold. The legend a journalist built in 1882 to sell books is still alive today on screens Upson never imagined. The same thing happened to Jesse James, with the editor of the Kansas City Times. Someone decided which story deserved to be told, and what didn't fit that story simply disappeared. But what disappears on paper doesn't always disappear in people's memory. And that explains what happened 69 years later. In the months following his Lincoln escape, Billy the Kid was far from the glorious outlaw movies later constructed. He was a 21-year-old who slept in other people's houses, ate what they offered, and moved at night so that no one untrustworthy knew where he was. Fort Sumner was his main refuge, an old military fort converted into a ranch in the Pecos River Valley in southern New Mexico. Dry heat in summer, cold nights, desert silence that cut sound at a distance. There lived the Mexican families who had protected him for years. There lived Paulita Maxwell, the woman most associated with Billy in those final months. And there, in the house of Pete Maxwell, the ranch owner, Billy returned when he needed rest. Testimonies from those who knew him in that period describe him in a way no movie used, a cheerful boy who danced at the Mexican ranchers' parties, who spoke Spanish without an accent, who laughed easily, and who at night, when his mood shifted, looked toward the door with that specific attention of men who know someone is looking for them. But there's something about those months in Fort Sumner that history books mention in passing, and that explains everything that came before. Why did those families trust him? Why did they call him Bilito? Because that Spanish he used in his last second was so his own. That comes at the end of this chapter. Pat Garrett knew it. In July 1881, the sheriff arrived at Fort Sumner with 2 deputies, John Poe and Thomas McKinney. They didn't arrive by day. They arrived at night on July 13th and spent the following hours waiting and asking quietly among those they knew. On July 14th, near midnight, Garrett entered Pete Maxwell's room alone. Maxwell was in bed. Garrett sat beside the headboard in the darkness and spoke to him in a low voice. What happened in the next minutes exists in only one official version, Garrett's. And here's the problem. Pat Garrett was the man with the most interest in the story turning out well. According to his account, Billy entered the room without turning on a light. He came from outside. He noticed someone was beside Maxwell's bed and asked, what came out of his mouth, we already know. Garrett writes in his book that the words were, ¿Quién es? ¿Quién es? Who is it? Who is it? In the Spanish-speaking towns of New Mexico, in the houses where Billy had slept and eaten for years, the phrase passed down through generations was different. ¿Quién anda ahí? Who goes there? Any Mexican who hears those words knows exactly what kind of Spanish that is. The Spanish of someone who has it inside, who thinks in it, who uses it when fear comes before the brain can choose. Garrett fired before Billy could see his face. The bullet entered his chest. Billy fell to the floor of the dark room. He was 21 years, 1 month, and 12 days old. But the story of that night doesn't end with the gunshot, because what came after has questions that remain unanswered. And 69 years later, a man appeared before the governor of New Mexico with a story that no one has been able to fully close. If this channel makes documentaries on real history, It has to say what the archives show. And the archives show something that always bothered historians. Pat Garrett didn't file the death certificate with the correct procedure. The burial occurred before dawn, without the protocol a case of this magnitude required. And the testimonies of John Poe and Thomas McKinney, the two deputies who were outside that night, don't match all the details of Garrett's account. This doesn't mean Billy survived. The academic historical consensus overwhelmingly holds that he died that night in Fort Sumner. But those inconsistencies exist, and for decades they fueled something the history of Billy the Kid hasn't been able to fully close. In June 2003, the Lincoln County Sheriff opened case number 2003-274 as an official murder investigation. The objective was to do DNA testing to confirm that the man buried in Fort Sumner was truly Billy the Kid. They tried to exhume his mother. They tried to exhume the body itself. Dr. Henry Lee, one of the most recognized forensic experts in the United States, analyzed in 2004 a carpenter's bench that supposedly had held the body that night. The results were never published. A judge blocked the exhumation of Fort Sumner. The marked grave, according to some historians, may not contain his actual remains after decades of flooding from the Pecos River. Case 2003-274 remains open. The doubts never fully disappeared. And that's where Brushy Bill Roberts comes in. A 90-year-old man who in 1950 said something not everyone dismissed as easily as it seems. 69 years after that night in Fort Sumner, an elderly man appeared before the governor of New Mexico. His name was William Henry Roberts. Everyone knew him as Brushy Bill. He said the shot in 1881 hadn't killed him. Brushy Bill Roberts was 90 years old in 1950 when he publicly appeared claiming to be Billy the Kid. He said Garrett had killed another man that night, that he had escaped, that he had lived for almost 7 decades under another name. His lawyer took him before Governor Thomas Mabry to request the pardon Lew Wallace had promised and never delivered decades earlier. Brushy Bill knew details of Billy's life that few living men could know. He described people, places, and conversations with a precision that unsettled those who interviewed him. He knew what Pete Maxwell's room in Fort Sumner looked like inside. He knew the names of the men who had been at the Battle of Lincoln. He remembered specific conversations only someone who had been there could know. The journalist who interviewed him in 1950, C.L. Sonicson, spent weeks with him and later wrote that he couldn't explain where that knowledge came from, that something in Brushy Bill's story resisted easy explanation. The hearing with Governor Thomas Mabry wasn't what Brushy Bill had hoped. The governor listened, asked questions, and when it ended, said there wasn't sufficient legal basis to grant the pardon. Brushy Bill left the New Mexico government building without what he had come for. He was 90 years old. He had waited almost 7 decades for that meeting. Brushy Bill Roberts died weeks later in December 1950 in Hico, Texas. Academic history today considers his story to lack sufficient foundation. Specialized historians place the theory on the margins of the verifiable. But that margin has a name, has a date, and has results that were never published. In 2011, Governor Bill Richardson of New Mexico received a new pardon petition for Billy the Kid. He also rejected it. Billy the Kid has been waiting 144 years for that pardon. But there's something that still doesn't quite fit. How does a man learn that kind of Spanish? Why did the Mexican families of New Mexico welcome him as one of their own? The answer was never in the movies. It was on that frontier long before Billy the Kid. Let's go back to that dark room in Fort Sumner. A young man who spoke Spanish entered without light and asked who was inside. That Spanish wasn't learned in a school. It was learned by living. He learned it from the Mexican cowboys who worked on the ranches of the New Mexico Territory, from the families who hid him in the Pecos Valley, from the men who taught him to herd cattle, to read the arid terrain, to survive on a frontier where the Spanish language was the most valuable currency a man could have. These men had a name. They were vaqueros, Mexicans, the same ones who built the American Old West with their own hands for 250 years before Hollywood decided to erase them from history. Billy the Kid treated them as equals in a territory where almost no one did, and they treated him as one of their own because they recognized in him something cinema never understood, someone who had learned to see the world from the same side as them. If you're over 60 and grew up in northern Mexico, Chihuahua, Sonora, Coahuila, Tamaulipas, or if your family came from the countryside, it's possible that someone in your history knew that world, that ranch Spanish, of work, of the frontier, the one used when fear comes at night and there's no time to choose words. ¿Quién anda ahí? That phrase comes from someone who had that language so deeply inside that in the last moment of his life, he used it without thinking, before any camera recorded it, before any script existed, because it was his. The book Upson wrote in 1882 under a sheriff's name built the most famous outlaw in American history. But there's something that book couldn't build, the words Billy the Kid said in the darkness of Fort Sumner. Without thinking, without choosing. Upson didn't invent that. It didn't appear in any movie. It was put into him by the Mexican cowboys who took him in, hid him, and treated him as one of their own for years. The history of those vaqueros, who built the real Old West and disappeared from the official story, is the next documentary on this channel. The same mechanism that turned Billy into a killer of 21 men also erased the men who taught him to survive in that territory. Men who spoke Spanish because they had been on that land for 250 years before any Anglo arrived, and who left something no one could fully erase, the words rodeo, lazo, corral, rancho, ranch, mustang, bronco. Every Old West word you think is American comes from them. That documentary is on the screen right now. Did you know Billy the Kid spoke Spanish before watching this documentary? I'll read you in the comments.